So, welcome to the lecture one on Flannery O'Connor's Wise Blood. I want to pick up immediately on something I said um, about the essay, The Nature and Aim of Fiction, which will be a departure point for um, your final essay assignment. Um, One of the key ideas that she presents in that essay is that what she calls the literal or the concrete elements of the story, and this can include anything that develops a pattern. For example, Hazel Moat's various forms of preaching. Right? Of course, he's a preacher who preaches a church without Christ. So there are various different titles that he gives to his church show the kind of different patterns of thinking in his mind, and one has to intuit or dig below the words that he says to figure out what he's really trying to do, right? The very fact that he's a preacher who preaches a church with denying certain forms of belief is itself an interesting and meaningful event. The rat-colored automobile that he buys, this broken down Essex that he buys, is meaningful. So anything really can serve as a kind of vehicle for accumulating meaning, and for Flannery O'Connor, that's all she means by symbol. She says that she hates to use the word symbol because people are afraid of it. It's like some Masonic handshake that once you figure out, then that takes some sort of secret initiative to figure out. And then once you do that, you have the secret of fiction, and you can figure out various forms of fiction. That's not what she means. It's something simpler and less formulaic, and therefore a little more difficult to understand. It takes a lot of real effort on the reader to sort of enter into the text and figure it out. So I want to pick up on something that she says about symbol on 71, page 71 of The Nature and Aim of Fiction, and it'll lead into Wise Blood. It's something I didn't talk about in the last lecture, but it'll lead me into a discussion of the novel. So she says at the top of 71, now the word symbol scares a good many people off, just as the word art. They seem to feel that a symbol is some mysterious thing put arbitrarily by the writer to frighten the common reader, sort of a literary Masonic grip that is only for the initiated. They seem to think that it is a way of saying something that you aren't actually saying. And so if they can be got to read a reputedly symbolic work at all, they approach it as if it were a problem in algebra. Find X. And when they do find or think they find this abstraction X, then they go off with an elaborate sense of satisfaction and the notion that they have understood the story. Many students confuse the process of understanding a thing with understanding it. So she says, I think that for the fiction writer himself, symbols are something that he uses simply as a matter of course. You might say that these are details that, while having their essential place in the literal level of the story, operate in depth as well as on the surface, increasing the story in every direction. I think the way to read a book is always to see what happens. I frequently mentioned that in your essays, correcting your essays. Tell me what happens first, and then tell me what it means. But in a good novel, more always happens than we are able to take in at once. More happens than meets the eye. So you have to deal with what happens, but you have to deal with what happens and try to figure out what it means. The mind is led on by what it sees into the greater depths that the book's symbols naturally suggest. This is what is meant when critics say that a novel operates on several levels. The truer the symbol, the deeper it leads you, the more meaning it opens up. To take an example from my own book, Wise Blood, the hero's rat-colored automobile is his pulpit and his coffin, as well as something he thinks of as a means of escape. He's mistaken in thinking that it is a means of escape, of course, and does not really escape his predicament until the car is destroyed by the patrolman. The car is a kind of death in life symbol, as his blindness is a life and death symbol. The fact that these meanings are there makes the book significant. The reader may not see them, but they have their effect on him nonetheless. This is the way the modern novelist sinks or hides his theme. So that rat-colored automobile, she says it's his pulpit and it's his coffin. Right? He sits on that thing. When he sits on it, he gathers some sort of he takes on some sort of appearance, right? Sitting on the automobile, some sort of stature. But the sense that it's an escape comes from the sense of America that Americans had in the 50s and 60s, and perhaps still do, of the automobile as a kind of American form of escape. Right? I used to, when I was 16 years old, I had a 69 Mustang Grande. That was a means of escape. I left the house at 6 o'clock on a summer night and drove around that 69 Mustang Grande with my friends in the cornfields of central Pennsylvania. I won't tell you what I was doing, I was driving around, but you probably can imagine at the age of 16, 17. But that car, we'd turn on the stereo, listen to we had 8 tracks back then, not CDs. 8 tracks were the new hot thing. They were great, by the way. Sound was great. So I'd sit in that thing. My seat, my feet were about 2 inches above my seat, and I would just sit in that car and drive around all night long. And that's what the car symbolized. So it's a false symbol for Hazel Motes, right? But it plays into that whole idea of the automobile as a form of escape, and it can take you places. And it doesn't take Hazel any place. And that's why when the patrolman comes and pushes it over the edge, in this completely arbitrary way of just wrecking his car. By the way, that the idea that a patrolman could do that and get away with it, has very much changed the way that police officers treat people they suspect or not even suspect of doing things. That sort of arbitrary thing is the cathartic moment in Hazel Motes' life, and from there he goes to blind himself and reaches a new level of self-understanding. When he looks down on an automobile, he's watching his own freedom be destroyed. It's an external representation of some means of escaping what? Well, that's a good question, what he's trying to escape. We'll talk about that. So these things accumulate meaning. The things in the story, the events, the words, the actions, the behaviors of characters, the mummy in the museum, the gorilla that Enoch Emery meets, the suit that he puts on after he kills the man. These are all meaningful things, and they accumulate meaning in the story and their attachment to other elements in the story. Okay, so that I think is a good segue into Wise Blood and what I'll try to do and trying to show the patterns of meaning in the novel. But I want to begin with O'Connor's author's note to the second edition, which is on page 1 of the novel. And you've got to remember that she is in 1962 has been diagnosed with lupus, and it's really ravaging her body. She'll be dead within 2 years. She is now busy writing short stories, and pretty much knows that she's become a great writer. The short stories she's written and will write are tremendous achievements, and will always remain in anthologies in American short stories. So she says she's reached that point, and this novel has now been in print for 10 years. It was published in 1952 when she was very, very young. I think she was in her early 20s, mid-20s. So she says, Wise Blood has reached the age of 10 and is still alive. I think that's typical of her humor. She's still alive. She's dying of this deadly disease, and she writes this way. Her humor is really dark, and it's directed not only at others but herself as well. My critical powers are just sufficient to determine this, and I am gratified to be able to say it. The book was written with zest, and if possible, it should be read that way. It is a comic novel about a Christian malgré lui, and as such, very serious. For all comic novels that are any good must be about matters of life and death. Wise Blood was written by an author congenially innocent of theory, but one with certain preoccupations. So what are her preoccupations? That belief in Christ is to some a matter of life and death has been a stumbling block for readers who would prefer to think it a matter of no great consequence. For them, Hazel Motes' integrity lies in his trying with such vigor to get rid of that ragged figure who moves from tree to tree in the back of his mind. For the author, Hazel's integrity lies in his not being able to. So most readers think that the integrity is Hazel Motes is trying to get rid of Christ. The author thinks the opposite. The fact that he can't get rid of Christ, that shows his honesty. I think that usually it does. Well, she says, does one's integrity ever lie in what he is not able to do? I'm just thinking about that in many ways. Sorry. I'll comment when I'm done. I think that usually it does. For free will does not mean one will, but many wills conflicting in one man. Freedom cannot be conceived simply. It is a mystery, and one which a novel, even a comic novel, can only be asked to deepen. So this sense of being of one's integrity and being what one can't do. I think what she means by that is that one's integrity lies in recognizing one's limits and the perhaps coming face to face with what one is and one has made of oneself, despite the fact that what one is could possibly be determined by other people. That's too bad. At some point, that is you, and you have to acknowledge that. So this really is an Oedipal story. This is a story about a kind of Oedipus Tyrannus story, in which the integrity of the characters lies in recognizing their faults and their limitations, rather than wallowing in them and accepting those faults. Hazel is the only one who breaks free of all of these characters. The rest of them have pretty much come to grips with the wretched nature of what they are, and will try to make the best of that. Hazel tries to run away from it, run away from acknowledging what he is and what he's become, and ultimately can't do that. So that leads us into the novel, this sense of a divided will of many wills in contradiction. That's Hazel and all these characters. They're divided. Their consciousness is divided. They're unaware of who they are. Hazel Motes comes to realize what he is. And his response is violent as he tried to run away from who he has become. So the Christian elements are here. Flannery O'Connor is a Catholic, but does not write about Catholics. Generally, she writes about typically Protestant figures in the South, and Hazel Motes is no one of them. Is one example of them, of one of those. I want to just mention the name. I'm back outside, and it's loud. There are a lot of motorcycles running by, and you might hear in the background a thunderstorm coming. Sorry, but I had to get out today, and it's a Saturday afternoon, so I'm in a t-shirt. I'm very casual today, but so beginning with the name Hazel Motes. If I was in a lecture with all of you present, I would ask you at this point to think about what that is. The name purely arbitrary? No, nothing in Flannery O'Connor is purely arbitrary. This name is deeply meaningful. And I wanted to, you probably are thinking, well, think about this for a moment. The name Hazel, or the word Hazel. This is funny because my kids just found a stray cat about 2 weeks ago, and they named it Hazel. Why? Because the color of its eyes are hazel. So I think immediately, probably, most people, when they think of the word hazel, they think of the color of a person's eyes. It's a very rare color. I happen to have hazel eyes. My mother was light blue eyes, clear blue eyes, and my father had brownish eyes, so I got both of them. I got the best of both worlds. So the name Hazel refers to the color of eyes, I think. Suggestive of that. Notice how it's suggestive. It's not. It's symbolic. And motes. Well, what do we think when we think of mote? There's only one context, and this would have been readily recognizable by most readers of her time. I think maybe we can't expect this with readers now, but motes, a mote in one's eye. It's the parable. It's the parable that Jesus gives of judgment. When someone judges somebody else for their sins or their weaknesses or whatever, their limitations, Jesus upbraids people like this and says, take the mote, take the log out of your own eye so you can see to take the speck out of your neighbor's eye. So don't judge others unless you have a clear sight. Hazel is blind because he has a huge log in his eye. And that log doesn't let him see himself or others clearly. So already we have in the name Hazel Motes an image. Again, you have to be thinking, and you have to, it's obviously not apparent on the opening sentence, but as the novel accumulates, one should recognize this. The name is actually significant and is who Hazel Motes is, a man blinded by his own judgments of others, who does that, who judges others so he doesn't have to judge himself. How does he get this way? Well, we'll figure this out. I think there's enough evidence in the novel to see this. So there's an interesting. We find Hazel Motes on a train. I'm imagining this train is probably a train through the Midwest coming from Chicago down into Tennessee. That would be a train a typical train. I'm actually thinking of a train called the City of New Orleans, which was made famous by Arlo Guthrie in a great song, The City of New Orleans. He talks about all the stops that are made through, and it describes these rolling hills and this country scene. So I imagine this is perhaps maybe even the City of New Orleans. Hazel doesn't quite make it to New Orleans. He has to get off at Tennessee, East Broad, Tennessee. The setting of this, of the hogs and the red sun and the plowed fields and the rolling hills, is evocative of a kind of country life, agrarian life. I think it stands almost as an opposition to Hazel's own sense of anxiety and tension that we find in this opening scene. And this is really, the opening scene really gets us acquainted with Hazel in really remarkable ways, brilliant ways. So the descriptions of Hazel Motes, Mrs. Wally B. Hitchcock, the porter, they show a man who is deeply immature, who's trying to hide his own insecurities through abrupt, abrasive comments, put downs. This is a man who's really ready to jump out of his skin. I mean, completely ill at ease with himself. And that puts him at odds with everybody else that he comes in contact with. So the purpose of these scenes is to show that, but give us a really concrete sense of his character. The sense of a man trying to break free from shackles. He's going to Talkingham, the city that he'll eventually wind up. Don't know nobody there, but I'm going to do some things. I'm going to do some things I never have done before, he said, and gave her a sidelong glance and curled his mouth slightly. He's trying to shock her, right? But he's also screwing himself up for this action, right? He's going to he's going to immerse himself in certain behaviors that he's never performed before that will largely corrupt him, I think. So again, the sense of tension, of uncertainty, of fearfulness. He's obsessed, angry, intense, deeply immature. Regardless of what he's going to do there, he can't get out of two issues that dog him, and that is his not latent, it's almost obvious racism that is part of this guy, makes him very unlikable. And God, the sense of God, and an attempt to sort of very brusquely criticize anybody who thinks is religious, and that's probably everybody he meets who's respectable on the train in the 1950s, right? So we get Hazel's character coming out of this through his inability to sleep in this sleeper, right? That is part of these trains. They're kind of like closets. They're kind of like, well, they're like coffins. They make one claustrophobic, and obviously the porter has to lock him, close him in there. And he can't stand it. He can't stand it. Why? And this is brilliantly done. It brings back memories. What kinds of memories? Traumatic memories. Memories of trauma. This is what he recalls. This is on page 15 of Wiseblood. In his half-sleep, he thought where he was lying was like a coffin. The first coffin he had seen with someone in it was his grandfather's. They had left it propped open with a stick of kindling the night it had sat in the house with the old man in it. And Hayes had watched from a distance, thinking, he ain't going to let them shut it on him. When the time comes, his elbow is going to shoot into the crack. This is brilliant. This is his grandfather, who is obviously the most important man to him, right? He's thinking about his dead grandfather. His will is so strong, he's going to resist death, right? This guy must have been quite a figure, intense. His grandfather had been a circuit preacher, a waspish old man who had ridden over 3 counties with Jesus hidden in his head like a stinger. This is an idea of a bee, and he's going to come and sting you with Jesus. This is a typical kind of preacher, full of fire and brimstone, sin mostly, accusing people of sin. The God of accusation and guilt. When it was time to bury him, they shut the top of his box down, and he didn't make a move. So the image of the preacher, right, the grandfather preacher, who obviously taught Hazel Motes how to think about Jesus and Christianity. This memory, obviously it's a kind of memory that's built up. This is a very deft way for Flannery O'Connor to introduce us to Hazel Motes. It introduces us to who he's going to be, right? When he was 18 years old, right, he realizes what he's going to be. He was going to be a preacher. This is on page 15. A preacher like his grandfather. And a preacher can always do without a foot. He's thinking about getting his foot shot off in the army. A preacher's power is in his neck and tongue and arm. His grandfather traveled 3 counties in a Ford automobile. Oh my gosh, there's a major storm coming. I'm gonna have to pause this. I had to move into my son's room, and I'm gonna conclude this. I'm just gonna do chapter 1 and conclude this, or maybe just chapter 2. I'll give you a brief introduction to Wise Blood. Probably finish Wise Blood with the next lecture, the longer account. So, what else do we get about this? Well, the Essex, right? The Essex, the rat-colored automobile he buys, obviously is a knockoff of the Ford car that his grandfather owned, but sorry, there's a lot of activity going on here as I'm trying to do this, but the Ford that his grandfather used and preached upon will be an image, right, that will be picked up. Hayes is on his Essex, his rat-colored automobile, sitting like his grandfather did, but preaching a denial of Christ, right? And what's he trying to get away from? I think it's pretty clear here. This is a description of his grandfather. And you imagine that Hayes must be thinking about this. This is we're not given this directly, but we're given Hayes's background. He carries this idea with him about his grandfather throughout his life, through his life. People gather on his Ford because he seemed to dare them to. He would climb up on the nose of it and preach from there, and sometimes he would climb onto the top of it and shout down at them. They were like stones, he would shout. But Jesus had died to redeem them. Jesus was so soul hungry that he had died. One death for all, but he would have died every soul's death for one. You see the way in which Christianity is being presented here. Did they understand? Did they understand that for each stone soul, he would have died 10 million deaths? Had his arms and legs stretched on the cross and nailed 10 million times for one of them, the old man would point to his grandson, Hayes. He had a particular disrespect for him because his own face was repeated almost exactly in the child's and seemed to mock him. So Hayes looks exactly like his grandfather. Is the spitting image of him in a way, right? And the grandfather despises him because he sees his own image. It shows the kind of despicable sense of the soul that this kind of Christianity has taught to these characters. Did they know that even for that boy there, for that mean, sinful, unthinking boy standing there with his dirty hands clenching and unclenching at his sides, wonder why he's clenching and unclenching his hands, because he wants to smack his grandfather probably. He feels ashamed and embarrassed as being used as an example of guilt. Standing there with dirty hands, clenching his, unclenching at his sides, Jesus would die 10 million deaths before he would let him lose his soul. He would chase him over the waters of sin. Did they doubt Jesus could walk on the waters of sin? That boy had been redeemed, and Jesus wasn't going to leave him ever. Jesus would never let him forget he was redeemed. What did the sinner think there was to be gained? Jesus would have him in the end. So the redemption there, of course, is in the background. Really, what Jesus is pursuing is the sinner, right? And it's all violence and all guilt and all sinfulness and the crucifixion. So this kind of Christianity is a kind of shameful focus on sin and one's own guilt is what is behind Hazel's own sense of Christianity, and obviously a sense of himself, right? So the kind of irony of the final scene in chapter 1 where he can't sleep in the boxcar and has to get out, right? The kind of claustrophobia. You get the sense there that he is you get the sense there that he is trying to get rid of his past, trying to break out of his past. The coffin where the old man is trying to he imagines the old man getting out of the coffin. This is Hazel breaking out, right? He can't handle the memories, the trauma of this. So the last dialogue is extremely, it shows the way that Hazel has rejected Christianity. He uses the name Jesus in a way that no one who's a Christian would in vain, right? You don't use the word God's name in vain. So he says, Hazel says, I'm sick. I can't be closed up in this thing. Get me out. The porter stood watching him and didn't move. Jesus, Hayes said, Jesus, right? It's almost blasphemy. It's almost a curse word. The porter didn't move. Jesus been a long time gone, he said in a sour, triumphant voice, right? So the sense of I think that the video block there, I'll read that again. He said this, Jesus been gone a long time in a voice that's triumphant and sour, right? Mocking. Hayes is not quite there yet. The attempt to escape there. Again, we see the pattern of Hayes's own upbringing, right? Wanting to be a preacher, thinking he was going to be a preacher, thinking that he was going to be like his grandfather, despite the fact that his grandfather, or maybe because of the fact that his grandfather um, was such a powerful preacher at evoking the sense of fear and guilt and sin. This is something that hard to get rid of as a child. Um, so, chapter 2, we arrive in Talkingham. It's urban. Frequently, Flannery O'Connor's urban cityscapes are places of sin and iniquity, bad behaviors, right? The taxi driver who picks Hazel up sees him immediately as a preacher. Um, so, he says, it ain't, the taxi driver says, it ain't anybody perfect on this green earth of God's, preacher nor nobody else. And you can tell people better now how terrible sin is if you know from your own personal experience. It's an interesting point that I when I read it, I think this is a bit of homespun advice from Flannery O'Connor, maybe even speaking from her own vantage point. So I just want to say something about. I probably should go back and say something about the his return home to East Rod, his old home where nothing is left. He's looking for remnants of his mother, who he clearly at least admired or respected. Perhaps she was a form of comfort. Perhaps she was a form of love even. And he goes there and sleeps on the floor, doesn't find anything, finds very little left. And a ceiling board falls on his head and cuts him. I mean, this is just like, horrible, right? It's like trauma all over again. So his inability to go back and find anything meaningful is also a kind of it points to his life, right? It's clear that his father is either abusive or absent, perhaps an alcoholic. The return to East Rod also highlights what has happened to him, right? He felt he was impervious to falling, right? Which, of course, pride comes before a fall. That's what they say as a kind of Christian motto. The fact that he feels impervious to falling, and the fact that he has fallen, he has in fact performed some of the sins that his grandfather probably warned him of, makes him feel even more guilty, right, and more ashamed and more worthless. How did it happen? Well, he went in the army, and he wound up being neglected. He wound up being introduced to all kinds of things, all kinds of vices, all kinds of cruelty, all kinds of. I mean, the army, people can be brutal, right, to each other. So he's isolated. He's alone. He has no support, and it's clear that his time in the army is what has corrupted him. It is what has led him to the situation he's in now. So O'Connor is here. Remember, in the early 50s, giving a kind of critical account of the way in which military life can be degrading, and I think in the 50s was. My father fought in the Korean War, and it left him damaged. Um, you know, now we understand trauma and the trauma of war, and PTSD is a diagnosed malady that we treat. He was just stomped on by the army, let go, released into the public, and here he is, a deeply wounded human being with a deep sense of guilt that has been drummed into him from childhood, and that he can't escape. How is he going to escape this? So the collision of the corruption and the way in which he's been largely abused by the army and psychologically tortured by this form of Christianity that's really impossible to satisfy and to come to grips with in a healthy way, has led Hazel to this point where he's going to try to live a dissolute life. He's going to live a life of pleasure and try to run away from the pain and the trauma of his time in the army, and the guilt and shame that has been accumulated as a result of this kind of Christianity that he's absorbed as a young man. So I'm going to stop there, and we'll pick up on chapter 3, and we'll move much more quickly in this novel through the next lectures.